Thursday, September 19th. Tonight on The National, Ottawa's ready with its new constitutional package. The CFL tries to protect its superstars. And on The Journal, dreams betrayed. The story of Ukrainian immigrants during World War I. A shameful chapter in Canada's history comes to light. The National with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. It's been more than a year in the making, but
coming up on The Journal.
Ukrainian immigrants. They came to start a new life in Canada.
They were just ordinary farm folks, I guess.
They ended up prisoners of war.
They said, why? What did I do? I came here to work. I came here to build. Then I got locked up. Why?
Dreams betrayed. A documentary report later on The Journal.
George Bush says there will not be another full-scale war for The Journal.
From pioneers to prisoners. The previously untold story of Canada's internment of Ukrainian immigrants during World War I. The big oh no. Montreal Stadium in trouble again. Is it goodbye forever or just au revoir? With Barbara Frum.
Good evening. This country has always liked to conceive of itself as a sanctuary for those seeking a new beginning. And because those immigrants helped to build this country, Canadians consider this a place of tolerance, a refuge for the persecuted. But there is a dark side behind that idealized picture. In turn, the Irish, Italians, Jews, Asians, Japanese Canadians, among others, have all felt the hand of intolerance at some time in this country's history. Tonight, the story of how another prominent group of immigrants, the Ukrainians, came to Canada as friends and found themselves the enemy. Sharon Basaraba of CBC Winnipeg has this documentary report.
The Ukrainians and land are synonymous. Every Ukrainian wants a piece of land.
It's a big country, lots of things to do. Strike the gold.
And hey, we'll live like kings. This was the dream that they had when they came here. But it didn't work like that.
The struggle to make a new life in a harsh land is a proud part of Canadian heritage. With a homestead and hope, anything seemed possible. But that wasn't true for many Ukrainian immigrants who came here at the turn of the century. Theirs is a story of fear and betrayal, one that until now has rarely been told.
He said he was under arrest. He was an alien, an enemy alien. And that's why they moved him into that camp.
Walter Doskotch is bitter over how his father was treated when he first came to Canada. His father was one of thousands of Ukrainian immigrants thrown into prison camps during World War I. Their property confiscated, their freedom denied. Today, in Edmonton, Walter is haunted by letters his father left behind. He wants to know why Ukrainians were locked up and exactly what happened in Canada's concentration camps.
Some fellow prisoners have been arrested under false charges and taken to the guardroom by the camp police. On the way to the guardroom and inside of the guardroom, they were hit with fists and kicked by the guard or camp police. You know, you just can't say you're bad because we think so. Some divine order in Ottawa decides that you're bad, so you're going to be locked up, and you don't know why. All you know is you came into this country to make a living.
More than 1 million immigrants poured into Canada in the years before World War I, lured by promises of freedom and free land, promises made by a government anxious to settle the West. Among them, 171,000 Ukrainians from the breadbasket of Europe. Hardy, land-hungry, the perfect pioneers. But they were strangers in this new land. A country dominated by British tradition. Today, at Fort Henry in Kingston, Ontario, those traditions are celebrated. But 70 years ago, the British majority made it clear that foreigners were not welcome.
Take post!
It was clearly reflective of a prevailing attitude in Canadian society at the time that Ukrainians were an inferior race.
Lubomir Lachuk teaches at Canada's Royal Military College, and he's a Ukrainian-Canadian Congress researcher.
There was a widespread impression in Canada among many different people that the introduction of Ukrainians and others into this country would lower the racial standards of the country. We simply felt these people would be better kept out. They were mongrels, they were inferior.
Number 2 gun, fire!
In 1914, World War I. In Europe, Canadians were dying at the front, victims of the German army. In Canada, thousands of miles away, many newly arrived Ukrainian immigrants were about to become prisoners of that war, simply for being Ukrainian. Most Ukrainians who'd come to Canada were from this region of Europe, along the eastern border of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The empire was allied with Germany, making it Canada's enemy. Ukrainians who'd come to Canada were seen as Austrians, each one a potential threat.
Suddenly, the government of Canada is confronted with a problem: how to deal with tens of thousands of quote-unquote enemy aliens living within Canada.
Those enemy aliens were forced to register with local authorities. Fear and suspicion were running high. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police used the newly passed War Measures Act to lock up anyone who might be a threat. Retired General Sir William Otter was put in charge of the prisoners. A toughened veteran of the Riel Rebellion and the Boer War, Otter began setting up official camps across the country, 26 in all. Desmond Morton is General Otter's great-grandson. A professor of history at the University of Toronto, he's written Otter's biography, and he's an expert on the internment operations.
Well, he may have believed, and I think eventually came to believe, that there were some people who posed a threat to peace, order, and good government in the country. The thousands of people who've been swept up by local tribunals and officials and such like pose no threat at all, and indeed were a diversion of the war effort. I think the feeling in internment is that you do the reverse of the proper procedure in the criminal law, and that you presume guilt before innocence. In other words, you lock them up before they can blow up the Parliament buildings or the bridge, and therefore if the bridge doesn't get blown up, it isn't because they never intended to, it's because you stopped them before they even had the thought.
Many of them protested their innocence. They told the authorities that they had no desire to fight for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There were no acts of sabotage. No one to this day has ever shown that there was any legitimate reason to intern Ukrainian Canadian civilians in this country, and yet the measures went ahead. And as we sit here today on this fine, warm summer day, I can't help but wonder what it was like to spend several years interned here. It must have been a rather horrible way to spend some of your first years in Canada.
Fort Henry became Canada's first permanent internment site. Others were in more remote areas of the country, like the Spirit Lake camp in the bushlands of northern Quebec. In all, there were almost 9,000 internees, Germans, Turks, Slovaks, and others. Some were bona fide prisoners of war, but most simply civilians. 5,000 of them Ukrainian men, and a handful of women and children. Mary Haskett may well be the last Ukrainian survivor of the camps. Today, she lives alone in Mississauga, Ontario. She was just 6 years old when her family was taken to Spirit Lake, Quebec.
It's like a town, all houses built for the prisoners, you know, and there was a school on one side and roads, I can remember. Oh, yes. But then there was also the bush where the men worked. Nothing but bush and barbed wire. You couldn't escape if you tried.
Mary Haskett's father had been out of work in Montreal. Unemployment was high and competition for jobs fierce. Enemy aliens were the first to be laid off or were outright fired. Many were rounded up, sent to the camps, and put to work for 25 cents a day.
It was real army soldiers and bayonets, and they were ready to conk you if you didn't behave, you know. You couldn't go to a town close by unless you got a pass from the captain. And if you dared try it, you'd be in really bad trouble. They were strict, very, very strict.
Years later, Mary Haskett told her family about the camp.
We would come back and say to Mom, are you sure? You must be mistaken, Mom. Maybe this was something you heard from Grandma or Grandpa. Maybe they were in a prison camp. Maybe they told you when they were children that they were in a prison camp, maybe in the Ukraine. It can't be. You know, there's no such place as Spirit Lake.
Mary Haskett's family found it difficult to believe such a thing could have happened in Canada. Other survivors never spoke of their experience. Fear and shame kept them silent.
Just watch your step.
Today, few people know the story of the camps. Fewer still know where to find them. Gordon Rutherford is a warden in Yoho National Park. He's lived here in the rugged backcountry along the BC-Alberta border all his life. He knows how harsh conditions must have been for the men imprisoned in this remote valley.
The worst had come around spring when the water started flowing, and it almost had flood conditions here. And it's, as you see, it's good for growing vegetation and good view, but when it comes to a campsite, it has to be about the worst. The remnants of wood that you see out in front of us is actually this building you see out in the forefront here. And this area over here is where the prisoners lived. The POW actually built the structure themselves. It was a tent camp to start with. And they brought in 25 of the men to start with, and they started building, and then they brought other men in as the structures got built.
In the shadow of the Canadian Rockies, they built their own prison. Then they went to work, laboring for the good of the country. Thousands of tourists visit nearby Banff each year, unaware that the national parks in the area owe a debt to the labor of the prisoners. Records show that hundreds of men were brought to Banff to work on roads and other park development projects. During the winter, they lived on the grounds of the park's famous Cave and Basin hot springs.
We're walking on the grounds that served as the regimental parade grounds, and internees were brought here on roll call and the like. Only 50 yards distance, the internees in sight of these tourists labored day in, day out for some 3 years.
Bogdan Kordan is a political scientist at Grant MacEwan Community College in Edmonton. He's an expert on the Banff internment sites. Why do you think Canadians should care about what happened so many years ago?
Why should Canadians care? There is a shocking ignorance of what has transpired here and elsewhere across Canada, which is so fundamental and pivotal to understanding our own history.
He's written a book about the camp at Castle Mountain, just outside of Banff.
No, this is the Castle Camp, and it's approximately 150 yards off the roadside. To the left over here is Castle Mountain. and the enclosure contained 650-odd souls. The camp in itself was in existence for 2.5 years, and all sorts of unspeakable things occurred here. We have evidence to the effect that individuals were shackled to trees and left there. You know, individuals, for instance, were hauled down to the riverbank, tied to a yoke, and tied to the end of a rope with a horse dragging them upstream for several miles or whatever. And this was a means of disciplining the internees. But we find even visual documentation to this score.
Prisoners complained of the abuse. One wrote in a letter to his wife, "We cannot go on much longer. We're not getting enough to eat. We are as hungry as dogs." Even the camp commandant lamented the conditions. He wrote to his superiors saying, "Some prisoners have boots with the soles half off. Over 100 of them are in rags. I am ashamed."
The parks are, you know, a national treasure, if you will. And as a national treasure, it is one that was not without cost, both in terms of suffering and human misery. And I think that story needs to be told.
The official record, kept at the National Archives in Ottawa, helps to tell that story. Claims of cruel punishment are confirmed in reports and diaries written by the man responsible for the camps, General Otter.
There had been cases of brutal punishment, as he described it, by the guards of prisoners. And this was unacceptable to him, and it was a reason why the Banff camp had to be closed down.
What's left of the camp records is also here, a dry account of personal tragedy. Mary Haskett remembers the harsh conditions at Spirit Lake. She lost her baby sister there.
Well, it started out with a cold, I guess. And then I guess it developed into pneumonia. I don't know, but there was no doctor to attend to her or anything like that. My mother did her best, as far as I know.
And what happened?
Well, she just died suddenly. It's very sad, taken that way. It's a beautiful little child.
Disease was common. There were suicides and madness as well, as despair and loneliness took their toll. For many, escape offered the only hope of an early release. Others were less successful. At least 10 were killed or wounded in their attempts to flee. As the war dragged on, thousands of reinforcements were sent to the front, leaving a severe shortage of manpower at home. To fill the need, the government paroled hundreds of its prisoners. Today, records show that many of the internees did not get the money they'd earned in the camps. Few of the personal effects that had been confiscated were returned or claimed. Suitcases, watches, even Bibles. Archives show that in 1926, long after the camps were closed down, there was still money belonging to internees in Ottawa's bank account, more than $32,000. Today, there's a growing interest in these files at the National Archives, people trying to piece together their family history. Their letters land on the desk of archivist Rod McFall.
They've heard second-hand stories, third-hand stories about how they had a relative who was in one of these camps, but we do what we can with the records that are available. It's disheartening, I would say, because the people that write to you are, in many cases, they're elderly themselves. They've heard something and they want to put it together now into some broader sort of context, and they don't know how to do it.
In Brandon, Manitoba, some of the people who know the story are starting to speak up.
They were kind of afraid because they had to keep quiet, or else any place they go, somebody find out they were talking about it, they'll get a rough treatment.
Al Bobbick's father was interned in the Wheat City Arena in Brandon.
It wasn't sweet like that. It didn't wake up in the mornings. You could see suicides hanging off that rafters there, and life was miserable for them. What was their reason putting them there? All those people, why did they do that? And who did they get that authority from? Why didn't they check better with it to see who they are, not just round them up and put them in there? This was the the arena where they played hockey and held all the winter fairs years back. That was before the First World War. They had them locked up, internment here, and there was about 1,800 internment people put in this place here, which it wasn't a very sweet place. Because my dad served his time there.
What sort of effect did the internment have on your father?
Made him bitter. It made all of them bitter. Here they had come to this country with all kinds of dreams and visions of owning land and getting rich because they were promised. They were promised that, hey, every CPR travel agent and steamship operator said, hey, you get into that country, boys, you're going to get rich. They said, why? Why were we locked up? What did I do? I came here to work. I came here to build. And I got locked up. Why?
More and more Ukrainian Canadians are asking questions. Why their parents and grandparents were interned and how it could have happened in this country. They've seen Japanese Canadians compensated for internments during World War II. And now, as they celebrate a century of life in this country, they say it's their turn for justice. Ukrainian Canadians say they're not looking for individual compensation. There are so few survivors left. But they say Canadians should know what happened in places like Banff. While the federal government has agreed to listen, many Ukrainians say they want amends for the wrongs of a tragic past.
We want the government of Canada to negotiate redress based on the moral and legal precedent of the Japanese-Canadian redress package. So that the community can institute the kind of educational programs that we believe we require to broaden public awareness of what happened during the First World War, and also to make up for the crippling legacy of these internment measures within the Ukrainian-Canadian community.
Almost everybody has grievances against the past, and I think understanding what happened and trying to learn for the future is one thing. Trying to pay people off for what their ancestors or what they may have experienced is very, very difficult.
You know what he did, but who are you going to go to and who are you going to blame now? It's something that we know how he was punished for no reason, and you just have to live with that.
Myself, I want an apology. I want an apology because these guys deserve it. They did nothing wrong.
They were just ordinary farm folks, I guess. Thought they tried good luck at a bigger country, had more openings, strike it rich. Well, the dream fell apart. Very sad.
For the Journal, I'm Sharon Basaraba.
That documentary was produced by Andy Blick of CBC Winnipeg. When we come back, we'll go to Montreal, where that city is divided over what to do about one of its most famous landmarks. Olympic Stadium, the Big O. After 15 years, it's still not paid for, still not finished, and now it's falling apart. Is it time to call in the Wreckers Ball? That story when we come back.